Well, welcome back, everyone. Time for our last panel of today. So far, I think this experiment is going smoothly, and we really appreciate everyone helping us contribute in various ways, both here and online. Our last panel is on discourse and reasoning in the digital age is the topic of the paper. It's from our Digital Literacy and the Health of Democratic Practice panel. The panel is led by Joe Kahn, who I'm going to turn it over to now to introduce the panel and members of the writers who will provide the presentation. Joe?
Oh, thanks so much, and hi everybody. We really want to thank you for this opportunity, and I'll try to sort of move quickly through what it is that we're going to do. But first, just so that folks know, the group all wrote the paper together. We are, as a group, so there's me, but then there's also Antero Garcia from Stanford, Sarah McGrew from the University of Maryland, Nicole Mira from Rutgers, and Rendisha Tynes from USC. And I also really want to thank Donna Phillips for agreeing to be our discussant today. We're really looking forward to your thoughts, Donna. Donna is head of academic innovations for the DC Public Schools and a longtime leader in civics ed. Also really want to thank Diana Hess, who gave us feedback on the early draft of the paper. And we've incorporated some of that feedback already and are going to be doing more of it soon. But we'll blend that with the feedback that all of you give us. I guess I'll say just real briefly as a kickoff, this is an exciting area for all of us, and we all address different elements of it. I think we're really clear that when it comes to young people having opportunities for agency, for voice, for working to influence the world around them civically and politically, digital media opens up really big, new, important opportunities. And at the same time, there are a bunch of challenges that we'll talk a little more about. But because it is so new, I think compared to some of the other areas, we don't have the history of study in relation to it. So we're going to be able to conceptualize some of the issues, but when it comes to even basic descriptives of what's going on out there, as well as indefinitely causal claims about how activities in schools are related to particular behaviors of young people, we're really quite limited. There just is not a huge research base yet developed, so we'll say a little bit about that. I should say that all 5 of us have contributed equally to this paper. We've written it collaboratively, which has been a wonderful experience because we do come from different, we address different dimensions of these issues. But I'm particularly appreciative of Nicole and Antero for agreeing to lead our presentation. And so with that, let me turn it over to the 2 of you.
Thanks, Joe. So I think Nicole's going to share the slides. There we go. So the plan is I'll probably take the first little less than a third of our presentation just to talk about the context of what do we mean by the digital age, what does digital literacy mean, and then we'll look at some of the typology that was developed through this paper. And I just want to echo, I think, Joe's appreciation here that this has been a real pleasure to work with most of the panel members, with all of the panel members. It's been a real opportunity. So I think the important thing to know, we've been talking about this context throughout the day, right? I think that the digital life has just kind of been abutting all of the conversations from the first 3 papers. And so we know that digital is different, but what is different and what the digital stuff is something of a mess. So I want to start with kind of 2 theoretical lenses to guide how we're understanding the digital age for the rest of the day. So the first is this idea of participatory culture. This is largely attributed to Henry Jenkins, now at USC, about a decade and a half ago. So we can think about, this was largely a time of MySpace and burgeoning social networks, right? Early Web 2.0 as the kind of language of practice at the time. And what participatory culture means, and I think what's useful for us to understand, is it's largely understood as a shift from just consuming media to producing it. And this isn't just being a media maker, a filmmaker, for those of you in the room who don't feel like that describes you, but someone who might be sharing media, remixing, posting a meme or a GIF in a text message to somebody, retweeting a message, sharing a post on Facebook, right? These are all participatory practices that have fundamentally shifted our relationship with media and seen media as something that's malleable. We don't just watch the news or media shows today, we're interacting with media differently. And I realize that's an obvious point, but this feels like a fundamental starting point for thinking about how civics is shifting in a digital age. But this also means that we do have different kinds of civic relationships in regard to participatory culture. So networked activism, such as the spread of something like Black Lives Matter, feels like an important recognition of different forms of organizing, even if the on the ground activities might look very familiar to things that have happened historically. Similarly, we're seeing young people organize around fan-based activities. I put up a picture of the logo of the Harry Potter Alliance. These are young people who are passionate about their fandom, both for Harry Potter and for wanting to utilize that passion towards something, right? So they pretend to be a part of Dumbledore's army, a key trope from the last couple of books of the Harry Potter series, and engage in different kinds of activism. There's been lots of spin-offs of this kind of movement, but the Harry Potter Alliance has been a pretty prominent example. Importantly, these are new digital contexts that are shaping life both online and off. And so while mobilization is happening in person, and it's happening around kitchen tables, and it's happening with students in classrooms, we tend to talk about this as digital culture, right? But I just want to recognize that this is the ways that digital practices and digital tools are shaping an analog world, right? So the picture in the background is of a Black Lives Matter die-in, right? The practice of placing bodies on a physical space in order to make symbolic gesture, right? It's important to recognize that the digital doesn't just happen in this alternative space elsewhere. We've thought about this in terms of connected learning. This is largely work led by the MacArthur Foundation. This is one effort to basically help understand the kinds of learning practices that were emerging from young people in participatory culture. There's 6 practices that are highlighted on this chart. They might not be particularly clear to see here. I think the important thing to recognize is you could imagine the way that a young person playing in a video game community of something like Minecraft or Fortnite today might be deeply engaged in academic learning practices that are frequently overlooked in traditional models of schooling, and connected learning sought to capture what those practices look like. A couple of distinctions here. Connected learning isn't prescriptive. It wasn't and hasn't really been focused on formal educational settings. And for the purpose of this conversation, connected learning wasn't centrally focused on civic reasoning and discourse, although Joe's been leading a lot of work in that conversation after, I think, as part of the spread of how we've been understanding this space in participatory politics. So recognizing all of these pieces and what this means for civic digital reasoning and discourse, I want to then move to what's it mean for this kind of work to happen with young people today. So one of the key premises we start this paper with is this idea that youth engagement online is more equitably distributed. There are more opportunities and there's more kinds of participation than what we're seeing, I guess, most prominently right now in terms of youth voter turnout, if we can look at that, or the ways young people are identifying their participation or sense of engagement in civic activities as in schools and out. So the important thing to recognize is while we're seeing this debate among the Democratic primary of the youth didn't turn out, for example, for Bernie Sanders as a talking point after post Super Tuesday, it's not that the youth aren't just turning out for youth voting, right? That there's a deliberate choice that's being understood here, and the ways that we as people who are researching civic education and what's happening in classrooms isn't matching the kinds of civic activities that are happening outside of schools and outside of traditional formal political practice. This brings us to 5 different opportunities and challenges. And so I want to basically kind of step through each of these really briefly. So if we know that, if we go back one slide, Nicole, thanks. So if we know that the digital contexts and practices are murky and largely underexplored, I want to first recognize that if everybody has increased capacity for media creation and circulation, there's questions that we need to ask. There's questions of who is making a civic message? How are these messages being constructed? Who are they for? These aren't just about media literacy practices, although we do recognize in the paper that media literacy plays a pretty fundamental role and some of the work that we need to be doing, but a broader recognition in the shifts of recognizing, again, that media is malleable. Likewise, this changed nature of gatekeeping feels particularly important to recognize. We've historically seen news sources as gatekeepers. And so this is one piece that shifted, right? That news sources aren't necessarily the same bulwark of guidance for how we understand information. But likewise, I think the other kind of gatekeeping we can recognize is the shift of classroom power. If everybody has mobile devices in schools, it traditionally shifts how information is disseminated and who gets to gain that information in classrooms. So this is another form of gatekeeping. I'm going to pause on digital platforms and come back to that in a second. In terms of choice and control, we tend to worry about the abundance of choice, right? That's oftentimes seen as a really good thing. There's so many sources, there's a plethora of opportunities to engage in. And while we often see these as positive things, it's also flooded the media kinds of platforms in a way where we can't necessarily filter between the good and the bad, and it's also a problematic binary. But this is where we're getting increased forms of skepticism, which can be healthy, but we're seeing this burgeoning growth of conspiracy theories, and this is essentially a different way for us to figure out who controls which kinds of information is being gained by whom. And finally, trust and partisanship. I think Pew has helped us understand these highlighting shifting patterns in individuals' trust in political systems, news sources, and civic and political leaders. We're seeing less and less trust for particular folks, and we're seeing a further separation of different kinds of political identity and affiliation. So the thing I want to wrap all of this around is this kind of poorly developed picture from me of the Facebook as a platform, right? So all of these other pieces essentially sit on top of a few platforms on which most of our interaction online is existing. A platform like Facebook is one that clusters, guides, and controls the vast majority of the information of its users. Rather than a utopic vision of the vast space of online engagement, we imagined everybody could have their own website, their own little portal online. We have essentially cordoned ourselves off to a very few select platforms. We have Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, Amazon. There's not very many. We can count them on one or two hands at most. And over the last 4 years, what's made very clear is the political ramification of putting the capacities for media circulation, for gatekeeping, for control, and for trust in the hands of private companies that dictate our online life. To one of Megan Bang's earlier points, earlier this morning, or at least West Coast morning, I'm not quite sure what time everybody's in, what's understood as possible, particularly as we think about these platforms, is constrained by a select few technologies, and these two are shaping the civic lessons that are being learned implicitly and explicitly. So to this, I want to basically point to something like a three-pronged problem for us to think about. So if we put together this relationship between formal schooling and civic education has been long fraught, and I think the history, the second paper from today has made that pretty clear. The digital tools are adding an additional level of complexity to this. But there's three different challenges that we need to be addressing as we think through what this looks like in terms of civic education in traditional school settings. So the first is there's a fear of having political conversation in schools. This is something that was also brought up in the previous session. Having political conversations in schools in this particular context, whether it be about climate change or guns or immigration or police brutality or food insecurity, right? All of these are things that teachers may not necessarily feel safe to talk about. And in some of the work that Nicole and I have been thinking about, that teachers are not safe to talk about in terms of their own livelihood and what the blowback from schools and administration. The second is a fear of technology and bringing in unsanctioned outside voice, right? So oftentimes some teachers may not feel comfortable with the actual tools themselves. And so thinking about digital pedagogy, again, thinking about some of the work of Larry Cuban over decades at this point, has really shaped how we think about the role of technology. So even before we get to the civics, we aren't necessarily well equipped with understanding the role of digital technology vis-a-vis civic reasoning and discourse. And finally, the other piece of this that I think is important that isn't just about the digital, but plays a fundamental role is the fact that our schools just aren't snow globes, right? Our schools don't exist in a bubble from the rest of the world. So I recognize that the previous panel brought up social emotional learning, but I would just note that I think things like climate and things like the ways that both students and teachers are feeling in classrooms is shaped by the participatory culture stuff that I was talking about for a couple minutes here. All of that stuff is shaping what's happening in schools. And so if we're going to think about all of this discourse, it's all been mediated by the digital ecology that is both the signal and the noise simultaneously through which we're thinking about this. all this leads us to, and this is where I'm going to hand it off to Nicole right now, just a very fundamental fact as we're developing the rest of this paper, that the research base around digital civics is extremely thin. There's just not a whole lot of there. And so as we think about what does exist to shape the rest of this conversation, this is essentially an opportunity that we're seeing in terms of bringing together some collective energy.
Thanks, Antero, and thanks, everyone. You'll notice that I put the term digital civics in quotation marks. And one of the reasons that I did that is that one challenge we experienced across our panel as we were putting this paper together is the terminology. So already in the presentation, you've heard from Antero about media literacy. We've heard about critical media literacy, digital citizenship, digital civics. It's difficult, and everyone who's using these terms are sometimes speaking about slightly different endeavors. And so that complicates kind of our mission here, and something that is another challenge to the field, something that we want to hear from everyone here about. And also to clarify that this shift that we're about to make in the presentation and the shift that we make in our paper is that there is a lot more, as Antero was saying, going on with participatory culture and outside of school environments. And when we move into school environments, things get a lot more complex. So a lot of Joe's work that he's pioneered with Kathy Cohen and others around participatory politics, there's so much that young people are doing in all of the different spaces of learning in their lives. But now we wanted to focus on kind of what's happening as we try to bring those into formal school environments and the constraints that emerge. And of course, as we've all talked about, every presentation this morning so far has reflected exactly what we're saying, because of the fact, again, that the digital world is not a separate utopia from the rest of our lives. These are things that are happening that are basically exemplifying and magnifying the problems that we already have with identifying the normative values of civic education. So let me put this. Oops. So what we did was, when we took a look at what research does exist out there, we kind of organized what we found into a typology of the current approaches in digital civics education. And when I say digital civics, I'm thinking about the ways that young people are learning about being engaged in civic life through digital and online environments. I would note up front that, again, this typology is much more gray in practice. These circles are all interacting with each other, and there's programming that kind of overlaps between all three. But we wanted to tease them apart here for the purposes of analysis and exploration. So the first part that we're going to talk about is what we call safety and civility. But we got some great feedback from Dr. Hess about the possibility that maybe these should be 4 circles. Perhaps safety should be divided from civility. So we're definitely interested in getting feedback from the room about that. We know that it's late in the afternoon for many of us, so we're going to try to go through this quickly and structure this by giving kind of an overview, a quick overview, but then questions for discussion so that we can move to discussion as quickly as possible. So in the safety and civility realm, we kind of place in this bucket reasoning and discourse skills that students need to understand and manage their online presence, identify and avoid risky online behaviors, and interact with others safely and respectfully. So we have now seen, and I was kind of, as someone who is interested in civic education, my antenna goes up when I see digital citizenship programs that seem to be focused solely on this domain of helping young people to understand their digital footprint. So for example, as a teacher and a teacher educator, all the time when I'm on Facebook, I see teachers sharing things on their Facebook walls saying, hey, keep sharing this post, please, because I want to show my young people, I want to show the students in my classroom how quickly their information can spread across the globe, and talk about issues of data privacy and things like that. These are important, and I think a lot of programs such as iSafe are popping up. There are different programs that are made available to schools that are meant to align with current standards, Common Core ready, and give young people the chance to understand what it means to be safe online. This obviously interacts with lots of other structural factors. So I'm thinking about the fact that many school districts have firewalls up. We're also thinking about programs and software companies, data companies that work with education in schools that are collecting students' data in ways that are possibly not ethical. So there's lots of things that are going on around civics in this area that are not specifically happening in the classroom. But at the same time, there are a growing number of states across the country that are now putting into their education code requirements for young people to study either digital citizenship or media literacy, or again, with the terminology, some mixture of both. This section right here, this quote that I have, comes from the California Education Code when they put a new mandate in place to teach digital citizenship and media literacy. And I wanted to put this in here because I think it raises questions about what that term citizenship really means in this case. Is it functional, or is it really speaking about the social context in which we live? So this particular quote says that digital citizenship means a diverse set of skills related to current technology and social media, including the norms of appropriate, responsible, and healthy behavior. Major areas include safety concerns such as cyberbullying prevention. And so again, our group kind of was concerned about the fact that the word citizenship is being used here in a way that is pretty narrowly defined, to think about kind of apolitically, to talk about citizenship as meaning individuals controlling their own data and presence online, as opposed to a larger collaborative political and civic endeavor. Also, again, there has been a large-scale study of iSafe of showing that there are ways that we can use digital media to help young people gain knowledge about what their presence looks like online, but we have not seen a lot of studies yet that have shown that it's actually changing young people's behavior in any large scale sense. So we know we have data out there that cyberbullying exists. We have anecdotes about identity theft. We have lots of data that these things are happening. But when it comes to the procedures and practices that schools are then employing to help young people understand this environment, we don't have a lot of data to go on about what is effective and how this kind of digital citizenship learning can be placed into a larger context of social and political and cultural issues. So in a lot of ways, schools are kind of feeling in the dark and responding to the risks that are perceived by their students, and by their parents, and by their community members, and sometimes not putting them into a fuller paradigm of civic engagement broadly defined. The next category that we found, and again, programs often include multiple aspects of this at the same time, but one that's getting a lot of attention right now, and probably the area where we do have a little bit more research, definitely more research than in the safety and civility domain, is information analysis. So the ways that schools are trying to help young people develop reasoning and discourse skills to understand and analyze the source, nature, and purpose of the information they encounter online. So obviously, in this moment where folks are very concerned about deliberate misinformation coming either from foreign actors or from domestic actors, bias, partisanship, rancorous debates where it seems like we do not have a common grounding of information or any ways to sometimes understand the bias behind the information that's posted online in this time of decreased gatekeeping. There are organizations that are working to provide teachers with curricular resources that they can use to help young people to better analyze the information they find online. So obviously leaders in this group, and one of our panel members, Sarah McGrew, has done a lot of amazing work in this area. I encourage you to go into our paper and see the citations that are available so far that shows obviously surveys of the number of folks that need help, both adults and young people, in being able to analyze and evaluate information they find online. The Media Education Lab and Renee Hobbs's work in media literacy also does a lot of work in this area. So again, the tension that I articulated about the safety and civility domain was about whether it truly is engaging with civic engagement writ large. The tension that we want to bring up around information analysis as a whole is, what do we do once we evaluate the information we have? And what does it mean to engage in dialogue and reasoning if we still have divides amongst young people who are speaking to each other about what that information actually means? So media critic Dana Boyd gave a pretty provocative talk at South by Southwest back in 2018, and she kind of criticized a lot of media literacy education writ large. She said there's widespread sentiment that we can fact check and moderate our way out of this conundrum. This will fail. And she talked a lot about how the idea of media literacy, the kinds of critical thinking skills that we want young people to use when they analyze information, situation, to figure out what teachers should be doing with all of this information. And the final category that we kind of found is around civic voice and engagement. So the reasoning and discourse skills that students need to leverage online platforms to develop and share their perspectives on civic issues and engage in authentic digital civic participation. Ontario and I and a lot of folks work on this. Again, we have a lot of descriptive research at this point, but we don't have a lot of large scale work. We know there are platforms out there, and I know that in our chat, we've already been sharing a lot of different programs that utilize digital technology to get young people raising their voices and talking with others and engaging in action within the digital realm about issues they care about. The National Writing Project has been a leader in this as well. Ontario and colleagues just put out an article in the AERJ analyzing the Letters to the Next President project from the National Writing Project, where over 12,000 young people from across the country wrote letters to whoever the next president would become, and this is in the last presidential election, about the issues that they cared about. And so there's this idea of helping young people to understand that they do not need to be 18 in order to be considered active civic agents. They do not need to be voting, that the digital media can give them a space to share their voice in somewhat authentic contexts. So again, this was a moderated platform because again, this is all interacting with the constraints that young people and teachers and administrators are facing in schools. So this is a platform that allowed young people to log on once they turned 13 in order to share their views. They did not have to give any personal information about themselves. It did not allow dialogue to happen in real time or comments, but it allowed a space for young people to be able to log on and see a range of letters that they could click on, multimedia letters from across the country about what young people were interested in. And they've done other projects like this where young people can see themselves and their authentic voice being published online in ways that still fit within the constraints of schooling. We won't talk too much about this because it's not in the paper yet, but Ontario and I are also working on a project that tries to take this to the next level called the Digital Democratic Dialogue, or 3D project. This is a project where we are trying to help classroom communities from across the United States, 6 different classroom communities in very different demographic areas. These are teachers, high school English teachers, speaking to Carol Lee's invocation that we should think beyond social studies when we're talking about civic reasoning and discourse. These are English teachers that are getting their young people talking online without any kind of direct educational software, but kind of like a free-form social design experiment to see what issues matter to young people and what it means for them to dialogue with others who are living in communities that are within this nation state, but could have very different lived experiences from each other. In the context of that experiment, we are finding that there's all these as the bubbles that Ontario shared earlier, there's all these interacting tensions around what it means to do this in a school context, what it means to do this online, and what it means to do this within a very divided, residentially and educationally segregated context around this country. Earlier, we heard about teachers who are concerned about barriers to even talking about this work. So one of the teachers in our project talked about the fact that she's in a community in which it is considered divisive to even talk about political issues at all. So again, this speaks to if we're gonna have civic voice and engagement, the tension that I wanna raise here is that we have to deal with, again, how far is considered too far? Do we only treat civic engagement as an academic subject for study that young people will eventually engage in on their own outside of school? Or how much can we do it in school without raising the ire of community members? How can we acknowledge the fact that every thing we choose to teach or not to teach in schools is political? So those are all things that the digital realm is helping to magnify. These are issues that have always been there, obviously, but are now taking on a new resonance at a time where classrooms are kind of becoming two-way mirrors, as in the digital realm is letting young people access the world outside of the classroom through digital media, but it's also allowing us to see into what is going on in classrooms around the country. So it's creating this interesting effect. And then very briefly, so that we can move to conversation, what we've been concerned about generally as a group, as a panel, as we've examined the research that's out there so far, and what the context that teachers are facing, is that a lot of the curriculum is trying to speak to those 3 domains in isolation without necessarily always thinking about the larger social, cultural, and political context, and without really being able to speak to the shared norms and values of discussion. And this again reflects what we've been hearing all day through the papers. So again, teaching young people to be polite online, teaching young people not to bully each other online is not the same as talking about the kinds of rampant racist, sexist, other kinds of dialogue that are going on that go beyond the interpersonal and speak to structural inequities in our society. Same thing, we can analyze information and understand where sources come from, but what do we do when 2 citizens, knowing that the background of those sources, still are choosing to believe in different forms of information? And with civic voice and engagement, when do we say that some perspectives are not allowed in the classroom if they support racist or other kinds of hateful perspectives? Where is that line drawn? Since neutrality is not completely possible. And then very briefly, and this is Brindisha Tynes, one of our group members, is an expert in this area in terms of using race and racism as a way to kind of understand online in particular, to kind of illuminate how important it is for us to actually think about the social and political context more explicitly, because within mainstream civic education curricular materials, racism is often systemically under-recognized. It's brought up, and we know that racism has come up throughout the day today in every panel, but what it means to bring that into the classroom, to talk about as the basis for an American nation state, to go back to Carol's introduction about the two Holocausts that are informing all of this work in America. How do we actually use that as a basis to possibly get to the new imaginings that Megan was talking about, of a new form of agentic civic moves? How do we talk about this across those three domains that we mentioned earlier? And how do we, again, reiterate the fact that there is no digital utopia? The digital realm is going to reflect and magnify all of the philosophical issues that we have not answered throughout our history and all the other forms of civic learning. We're simply adding new settings and new tool sets that can help us to see the problem in new ways, to foster new innovations. And so I'll just end quickly with, there's so much, obviously, as we mentioned, this is a brand new area that we need to do so much more research in. We still don't have clear understandings about what we think are the normative ways that we should conceptualize and measure digital civic discourse and reasoning. We don't have it in analog settings, so we obviously don't have it in digital settings either. How should we evaluate these impacts and effects? What does digital civic discourse and reasoning look like in various communities and schools? What are the strategies? And I think the main question that we keep coming back to as a group, and that we want to speak to the larger panel about, is what values should guide how civic actors communicate and make shared decisions in civic life against this backdrop of systemic inequity and the forces of division that we know digital media can magnify. We're not comfortable with the idea of, I think some people thought the digital realm would usher in this new sense that nation states don't matter as much, the sense that we can talk about global citizenship, but that global citizenship discourse often then tries to minimize and kind of paper over the importance of the social and political and cultural context in each space. So how do we balance those two things? So I'll stop there and invite Donna Phillips for her comments. Thank you.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad for everyone who is still here on this awesome, beautiful day. Thank you, Joe and Taro, Sarah, Nicole, and Brandisha for your robust and ambitious work on this topic. I was so excited as I read it, and I wish I was still in the classroom when I read it, because what you have done, even in your draft form, is pulled together all the experiences of my own teaching over the course of 20 years. And so what I'd like to do in respect to responding to the paper and putting some more ideas out for us to discuss is just exemplify some of the concepts and issues with some thoughts for consideration, and maybe ways to make some connections, not only across the three different contexts you very eloquently lay out in the paper, but maybe across the whole day so far. So you very artfully sectioned the body of research so far into safety and civility, information analysis, and civic voice and engagement. So I'll never forget the first time I had my own students, this was 20 years ago, do their first historical investigation. I was doing history a la Bruce Van Sledwright and Weinberg and everyone else in the field at that time. And we were digging into sources, and the veil was lifted. We were figuring out how the textbook got this one little paragraph about who fired the first shot at Lexington, but we were reading all of these primary sources. And the kids were just ecstatic, and it was news to them that they could even dare question the authority of the textbook, right? And your paper talks about, we have these authoritarian structures, and have we inadvertently created additional authoritarian, yet not necessarily informed structures, but nonetheless influential structures that our students are now, our young people are now listening to. And so it was an awesome exercise. And what I witnessed happen was we prized so much the primary source that for weeks and weeks and even months after that historical investigation, the students didn't want to read the textbook anymore. It was garbage. You know what? This is secondary. Is this primary or secondary? What? Someone who lived there didn't actually say that? Well, I'm not going to read that anymore. And so we had to kind of like pivot back and talk about, you know, when we look at the reliability and validity and the use of the significance of all of our different sources of information, there's a place for everything. And so students tend to, when the veil is lifted, they tend to go to an extreme. And what I realized is that I still had to be there along the way. They were not free to go and continue to access information without my guidance as a teacher, without further deepening of their understanding of how to continue to source information. Flash forward now, my own son is now in middle school, and he came home and was researching for a National History Day, and was showing me the websites he was using. And I said, how did you decide which ones to use? And he said, well, the reliable ones are .gov. I'm like, oh, okay, why is that? Well, because they come from the government, so you can trust all the information. I'm like, okay, well, I mean, that's a good start. You know, what if it doesn't have all the information? What would be your next, you know, the next place you would go? And we kind of talked through that. It's really interesting to me to hear that was his takeaway from what he was learning about media literacy and how to source different things on the internet. In contrast to that, in working with pre-service teachers in the District of Columbia, we did that same historical investigation, and I asked them to pretend like if you were doing this with your own students, what might their reaction be? So we're going to look at resources or sources of information, one from a government official, one from someone who, you know, watched the fight, etc. And the teacher said, the kids would look at this one from the government official and say, it's a lie. And so they would discredit it, and they would give it a 1 out of 10 as far as credibility. And I had never thought about that. And what that made me realize is that in addition to what you're learning about the source itself, everyone brings in their own biases, their own experiences, and their own perspectives into their evaluation of those sources. And so I think that's an important place we need to think about with our students when we're looking at how we guide them in information analysis. What are they bringing into that conversation to begin with? It was fascinating. A rampant distrust of government for real reasons and for perceptions and their own experiences or their family's experiences would lead them to not trust a source of information. So let's see. Let me jump to one of my favorite quotations is, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And the internet and the digital age has allowed us to go fast. And so our district is going one-to-one computers. We've actually begun the deployment of the computers. I love how many terms in education are related to war. We've deployed the computers, and we've got boots on the ground in the schools to make sure the computers land. I mean, these are the words in our memos that we're sending out. We're on the front lines of it. But anyway, we're going one-to-one, and it's really exciting because the kids will now have access to their own devices. And so, you know, anytime the teachers need to plan something, they're going to have a lot more regularity with the use of them. And as excited as I am for that, I'm not as excited as everyone else. And don't play this for my boss. No, I'm kidding. It's amazing that we're going to have one-to-one, but not because that means every kid is going to sit with the computer and do their own thing. And we've engaged with parent groups and teachers to figure out what are the implications of this. And I think the fear is that now students are just going to be set free on these devices on their own without the guidance that they need. So we have the Common Sense Digital Citizenship lesson modules that all the students are doing. And I like that in this paper it highlights, you know, that serves a singular purpose, but it also actually masks why we have to think about cyberbullying and safety. And so what is underpinning the need for students to have to do this course on digital citizenship before they're allowed to continue to access everything on the computer? We don't question that. And that definitely is one place we have to dig deeper, and as educators figure out how do we take that as a foundation, as a starting point, because safety is important, but take that to the next level. When I think about civic engagement and the digital space, I have a lot of questions. And so one question I really like, and the paper draws this out nicely, I love that politics has become so much more democratic, that you don't have to be an important, rich, older person to have a voice, right? We have found this digital space. And so as a teacher, I got to meet my kids in that space for the first time. And so over the course of my 20 years, you know, my final projects went from create the poster that's going to convince people to do X, Y, or Z to, okay, you know, write the Twitter campaign that you're actually going to post to convince people to do what you want them to do, to let's use KidBlog. It's a similar online moderated platform that allows for different levels of interaction across schools, across districts, depending on what you want to do. But actually write your position and let's read comments to it and respond and engage in a discourse, you know, across time and space. And so that has been really fascinating, and I like what that does for students with their writing. I like what it does with them, with their sense of agency. I can articulate myself in a space and people can respond to that. It is still a simulation, though, of actual influence and actual politics in the real world. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We should absolutely continue to do it. But you know, we start with the idea of participatory democracy, and so that has to leave the classroom at some point. But to the extent that students can develop that sense of agency within the simplified environment, right, of Dewey's embryonic democracy, we need to keep fortifying that. But I also think that sometimes students might stop short and think that by posting this thing, I've done my thing, I'm in, I'm out, I've done it, hashtag activism. And so the field needs to bring together the ease of access and the democratization of student activism within these digital spaces, along with the actual opportunities to take that beyond the classroom and to take that into the real settings. So, you know, the other shift I've seen is that for a long time, I was a We the People teacher. My students competed in a national simulated congressional hearing. So we have a governmental process spelled out by our Constitution that students prepared for and actually simulated. And oftentimes they were in actual legislative chambers testifying on topics that were important to them. Now, it was a simulation. They weren't influencing real lawmakers to make decisions. But many times when there was a real decision to be made, my students were called upon to actually testify, and they were ready to do it. And so they went from simulation to real world. So that institution has been there. It's traditional. It happens all the time. We can watch it any day on C-SPAN. What we do in the digital space, how we make use of that, is not defined by the Constitution. There isn't a government process in place for how we make use of the interaction students are having and the action that they want to see happen afterwards. They have to create that themselves. I think that's hugely empowering, but very largely undefined. And I want the students to be able to have this lived experience in the digital space and know how to use that outside in the non-digital space. I'll also emphasize a couple more things. I've done a lot of work with iCivic. Woo-woo! It's an amazing, I've seen it go from some really cool games online for kids to play, which is what I used them when I was in the classroom, to this real powerful force for change in civic education. And I had a couple different opportunities to engage a large group of students in and playing a game, Do I Have the Right? Do I have the right? And so the students have to compete using their knowledge of the Bill of Rights. And so when we were figuring out what's the best way to structure this, we had enough computers for every kid to be on a computer. and I decided, let's limit that. They're going to be in pairs of 2 and 3 per computer, and they're going to have to talk to each other to make the decisions and play as a team. And what I really truly believe, just from the bottom of my heart with everything in teaching, is that it's the conversations that count. So one-to-one is great. The computer breaks, we got another one in the ready. But when kids are together and experiencing the digital space with a neighbor, with an elbow partner, that's going to change the experience for them. They're not going to get as lost in the weeds of what can happen on the internet. They're going to be moderated by the interaction with their peers. Now, they could also make very bad decisions together too. But it's in those conversations with each other that we're going to regulate the speed at which they are diving into the unknown of that digital space. So that's where I get back to. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. Students experience, we all experience our citizenship bodily. We are bodily here in this society. We can do everything we want online, but when we leave the computer space, we are still walking down the street and we are beholden to each other as citizens, as members of that same society. So we want students to feel that they are still rooted in something, rooted physically. We were talking at the break that you know, a lot of our meetings are being canceled, and now we have some virtual space, and certain meetings we're not going to do virtually because there is so much value in talking to someone face to face and interacting with them. I've done earlier research where students describe what they learn with, you know, I knew it off the top of my head, or I felt the nerves and the butterflies. And so there's a physical aspect to learning and being and interacting and knowing one another that can't be replicated in the digital space. And so the digital space has to become a companion to the students' development of who they feel they are as a citizen and as a member of society. Let's see. One last note I'll make, and this kind of ties back with what we talked about this morning. Online and digital actions change the experience of the we. So we talked about who are we this morning. Are young people able to be greater actors because of the digital landscape, or does this new, more democratic space further muddy the role of who they are in politics? In other words, because there are platforms and places and spaces for speech and expression, as well as for easy access for information, however reliable or unreliable, do our youth and others believe their role to be different than what it really is? And so I'll leave with one last thing, which is, you know, we think about like the digital landscape that's in front of us, and I want to reframe that as the digital layer. I want us to keep thinking about how we can use what's happening in the digital realm to solidify what happens outside of that digital realm, because this is where we live, and technology should be there to support it and amplify it, but not replace or supplant what needs to happen as we're walking down the street. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. We have Carol here who wants to, that's left over from the last event. But before we go into Q&A, I wanted to see if the panel wanted to react or touch upon any of Donna's comments.
I'd love to. I really appreciate your comments and your stories about being in the classroom. Sorry, there's an echo. What I'm hoping is our paper sort of gets the point across that teachers are unprepared, and there aren't civic education programs or curricula that adequately prepare kids for the digital landscape that they're navigating at this moment, right? We have a foreign power at war with Black Americans, right? Trying to sow racial division in the US. We have kids who see beatings and killings of their racial ethnic group, sometimes daily, virtual lynchings. There's a long list, right, of experiences that kids are having online. And like Antero said, the civic education does not match what's happening online. And what's going to be required is, you know, the historical knowledge that that was spoken about earlier. We need teachers who are able to think about, you know, our history as a nation, to think about race, right? And who will be able to center race in helping kids to navigate the experiences that they have online. And that, you know, that's not sort of this sort of survey of, you know, race, class, gender, right? It's going to require us to think systematically about the role of race in shaping outcomes for various groups, right? How do you teach a child to counter an image that represents them as an animal, right? Consistently, right? You know, represents people of color, well, Black people in particular, right, as monkeys, as gorillas, things of that nature, right? How do you help them to come up with counter narratives, right, that help them to place those messages in historical context? And so what we're hoping will come out of this manuscript is, you know, everybody who reads it sort of thinking about how important race is at this historical moment, and sort of the training that researchers and teachers have to do to adequately be able to adequately teach students, and also for researchers to adequately, you know, study what's happening in classrooms and online.
Great. We had a question from Natalia Smirnov.
Yes. Hello. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the paper and for demonstrating how much the digital affordances complicate the already complicated landscape of civic reasoning and discourse. I want to add a couple other complications because this is sort of my dear topic. I did my dissertation on how teachers are using technology to innovatively support civic learning in schools. And I think one complicating issue is that still needs to be continued to be talked about is the issue of infrastructure. So one-to-one is still not a reality for a lot of students, and a lot of students, while having access to some kind of internet, probably through a smartphone device, don't have access to computers. So when they get to access computers in schools, you know, it's an opportunity to do a lot of different other kinds of things other than to engage civically in the ways that teachers might want them to, which is understandable. And the teachers that are doing really innovative things, such as supporting students to create and circulate their own civic media through civic journalism, or constructing really complicated digitally supported simulations like Donna talked about, are kind of having to build an internal infrastructure that's like beyond what any teacher is being taught to do. So they have to become technologists, and also the infrastructure of support is incredibly, technological support is incredibly inequitable. So those are all just important considerations. Another thing to consider is that I've seen in my research is the ways that opportunities to engage in civic discourse online and find kind of political communities online can be can provide an outlet for a kind of political identity development that isn't supported in a student's family or local community or school. And that could be both positive, where if, you know, where civic discourse is not really supported by the climate of the school or is kind of limited or controversial or heated inside a student's family, they could find a space to kind of think freely and find interesting ideas. But it could also be dangerous and radicalizing in the, you know, in the similar way if the local community or family or school is not supporting tolerant and civic identity development, students can become radicalized in extreme ways towards you know, extreme ideology. So that's just two other layers of complication to add to your already complicating story that I want to add.
Great, thank you. So right now we don't have any other questions online or around the table. So if anyone online just wants to jump in or on the panel, if they have any reactions to that. And Walter, you just raised your hand, so jump in.
Yeah, thank you. Hello. I really appreciate this paper, and I'm very interested in its substance. And thanks to Nicole and Antero for that really efficient, interesting presentation. I think maybe I have a couple of questions, a comment and a question. The comment would be, when your 3 Venn diagrams reappear in the paper with the environment represented, something like the social, et cetera, environment, I think there's an opportunity there to include what we might call the psychological environment, to try to capture the research that is just rolling off the presses from psychologists about motivated reasoning, and which is, in a nutshell, something like the research that shows how reasonableness and reasoning follows but does not precede, call it intuition or impulse or perception, something like that. And I've been digging into that literature myself. I talk about it with Joe Kahn quite a bit. Joe has a really good paper about that. But I do want to continue to press our workshop to address that literature. I think as educators, we're uninclined to address it because we tend to be, well, anthropologists more than we are biologists. And that work is closer to biology than it is to being a culturalist. But I think it's, what it might tell us about civic online reasoning is, I think, potentially very rich, and there's an opportunity here to dig further into that. So then a good example of that work would be, say, Lodge and Tabor's book on motivated reasoning, but there's a whole lot more by many much younger scholars as well. And then a question I wanted to raise was about the romanticization of youth when talking about youth and voice, and when talking about youth and digital environments and social media. I personally find it really hard to disentangle the kind of the Rousseauian romanticization of youth when talking about digital learning, online learning, and the civic engagement and voice. And my own belief is that other people have trouble disentangling them as well. So what we have is quite a bit of romance about how much youth, how easy youth handle digital information, how easily they adapt to devices. And there's a lot is settled into the vernacular about youth at being digital natives, and meanwhile us old farts being anything but digital natives. And so I think a certain amount of sobriety around youth when it comes to both voice and digital literacy could serve us rather well now, as unpopular as it might be to encourage sobriety about that. I think it could probably go a long way. And that, my question there is, I wonder, Nicole and Antero, if you want to say anything about that, or am I out in left or right field about that, and it's not something I should be worrying about, or what?
I'll add one complication to this, and I'm sure Nicole can probably speak to this a little bit more, but I would say, one, I think it is problematic, the ways that young people are. I think the digital native stuff has largely been pushed aside at this point, which is useful. But I also think the civic world is partly complicit in saying that, in romanticizing youth in the civic world as well. Particularly, I think the notion that I see, in the last couple months is this idea that the youth will save us, right? So when we have a global climate strike, right, and it's led by a teenager, we say that the youth will save us, as if we are not somehow responsible for the mess that we're expecting young people to somehow innovate or iterate or design themselves out of. And so I think there's that piece. The other thing I'll just say is, as someone who is a former teacher and an educational researcher, there is just a romanticization and the possibilities of imagining what kids are capable of doing. I think it's what drives a lot of our work. So I do think this is a bias in how at least how I do this work. So I just want to name those two pieces.
Thanks.
And I would just add I think that the fact that educational research for so long has operated from a deficit perspective of what young people are capable of in many aspects of education and in civically has led to the pendulum swinging a bit in a necessary fashion to center like what the developing civic identities of young people are. And I don't know if I would call it romanticizing so much as just trying to like treat young people seriously as civic actors in all of its glory and all of its challenges as well. And I would also say that the more that we've spent time listening to young people talk about how they feel about the civic world right now in our current work, there's definitely this underlying sense of civic dread that young people we've found are experiencing across the country in terms of existential threats of climate change and whether they will have a world to live in the next few decades, the epidemic of gun violence, systemic racism, as Brandisha talked about. So I think that the young people we're talking to do not feel like the civic curriculum and much of civic education normatively framed is speaking to their experiences or valuing what they have to say in any meaningful way. And so I think that process of reimagining doesn't have to be romanticizing, but does have to take more seriously, not simply having young people fit into the system as it is, but letting us hear a little bit more of their voices about the fears and dreams they have outside of the box to then help us reimagine that system, because in many ways it's not speaking to the needs that they're experiencing every day in their communities.
Greg.
Sarah McGrew, and then we have two others.
Yeah, this is Sarah McGrew for everybody online. Just a quick thing to add, and thanks, Walter, for that comment and question. I think it's important to be clear about the difference, especially I agree with Antero, right? The myth of the digital native is pretty much dead, but being clear about the difference between the ways young people engage in the internet, and we have pretty strong information about the fact that they do, like say that social media is their top source for news, for example, but then separate that from the skills and developing better measures of the skills and reasoning the young people engage when they use digital spaces. So we can be clear about, right, the areas where they are already strong and the areas where they need our support. And that, I think, includes developing better understandings of things like how people engage differently when it's about issues they care about, right? Getting into those issues of motivated reasoning. And the research base is just really limited right now in those areas.
And then Chris, and then we'll go to two online.
And I'm not sure whether this is either here nor there, but I had a question about all of this instruction about, it presumes a large role of the teacher, and that's, kind of what we're talking about here. But I wonder if there's any consideration of also parent inability to understand what's going on, and converse to that, a consideration of what are a young person's rights when, as pertaining to adult interaction on the internet, that are we entitled to know what they're doing? Obviously I want to know what they're doing if they're lurking in the dark corners of 4chan so that I can, make any interventions. But at the same time, what if they're, trying to explore aspects of themselves? I'm thinking here particularly of folks who might not necessarily be out to their families or in terms of their sexuality, and is there some sort of privacy divide that we should be thinking of? And how can adults in general sort of think of drawing that line between where we should intervene and where we should let them explore for themselves?
Next I have Sarah Stitzlane.
Hi there. First, a thank you to this panel. This was the paper that I personally was most excited about reading, so thank you for your great work. I have a question about something that actually I think relates back to the earlier discussion that my panel on moral and philosophical foundations was struggling with in our response to Bill Galston's comments. Late in your paper, you say one of your recommendations is that we need to take, I'm quoting you here, principled positions on the values that should guide democratic discourse. I'm just wondering if you'll say a little bit more about what you see as those key values that we need in democratic discourse, at least in digital or online spaces. And if there's any, things that we really have to hold tight to. Bill Galston kind of pressed this morning that there's some things that are necessary values in order for deliberation to occur, things like equity and a commitment to justice, whereas other things like consensus or compromise or empathy might not be as necessary. So just curious your thoughts.
Anyone on the panel want to respond to that, or do you want to go on to Megan Bang's answer?
Yeah. I was wondering if Joe wanted to, because I think we had this discussion among our panel in really interesting ways about, like, I think each of us come from a slightly different perspective in terms of how much we would push on normative education structures and how open we can be in a paper like this if we believe that, for example, anti-racism should be an explicit value, and what that would mean to then, as Brandisha's saying, educate for that in teacher education and to structure civic discourse around a critical understanding of race and racism. And we had a lot of back and forth about, like, do we all feel comfortable with that as a group? What that would mean, does that put us into what Carol was saying is like a left-leaning project? I think those are open questions that we're all trying to grapple with, even as we all go individually in our research with our own commitments. I think it was an interesting debate for us as a group and then as a larger group.
I do think you're smart, Nicole, to be sensitive to how those values are read as politically sided in terms of parties, and being aware that once we start to articulate some of those values, we could get ourselves into those positions.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I appreciate that it is pushing us to figure out how to be clear on an issue like this. And I'm not sure that while it shows up in some ways unique and important ways in the online space, it's obviously not unique to the online space at all. I think that some of our hesitancy is that I don't think we have yet I don't know, again, to go back to Bill Galston's point, come to a consensus on exactly how to articulate this, but I think we all are recognizing a need to articulate stands in relation to this. Certainly, teachers in general, I would say, and I think our whole panel would agree, understandably have ground rules about the kind of discourse they want to have go on in the classroom. And they would articulate those ground rules in different ways, and they would think about them perhaps somewhat differently in online contexts, but they certainly, I think we would argue, do not want to affirm a kind of anything goes, and for example, as Bill was saying, certain kinds of racist statements or statements that clearly reject the notion of an equal valuing of human beings to be seen as a legitimate stance. And we need to have schools be places where young people can struggle and wrestle with the different things they believe and have space to articulate that as well. I mean, I think we were talking at one point, and Nicole, you might say more about this, I think a very sort of profound kind of challenge that shows up when you have folks from differing political perspectives talking with one another, where some may say things that at least warriors are clearly deeply, deeply problematic. And at the same time, it's in an educational context. So the question is, how does this become a learning experience? Not how does one sort of win the fight? It's tricky. And I guess I don't think we're anywhere near a clear statement on it. But I don't know if, Nicole, you want to expand on that, because I did find that dilemma quite significant.
So in our, we call it 3D, the Digital Democratic Dialogue Project that Antero and I are working on, we keep coming back to some interactions that we saw among the students in our project. And there's a student who we call Corey, who is living in one of our communities that would be described as more politically and culturally conservative. And in the context of online dialogue, which we actually consciously set this up to not use any kind of programs designed for education, because we wanted to step outside of kind of programs that have been designed for schooling spaces that might replicate existing practices, and we wanted to be more free and hybrid to see what would happen if we let young people talk. And the student was using like Prager University as one of their main sites, which for those who aren't familiar is a kind of right-wing news, I want to say news source, but it packages itself as a news source that others would then consider to be misinformation, and was talking to a group about gender roles and gender equity, and was saying things that could be very hurtful to those who identified as female in the group. I think there's so many different layers of what was going on there, because the teacher's first instinct as folks working within these institutions in which there can be backlash was wondering if we should even allow these conversations to happen because of the risk of hurt or pain or outrage, and not knowing how to deal with that heat. So that was one level. Then there was a level of, even if we used information analysis and helped Corey to understand the basis of where Prager University was getting its framing from, that did not solve this was not a matter of being able to tell Corey, that's not an okay source to use in this conversation. There's such deeper levels going on here of his identity, his family, his religion, his context, and how that was interacting in the conversation. But by getting past some of our fears and letting that conversation happen, there were some interesting moments of the veil kind of falling, of getting beyond talking points to some kind of real connection, some kind of critical empathy that was difficult to sustain, and we're not sure what that means yet. But there's something there about storytelling and about connecting past these traditional methods of just talking about information and safety and simulated voice to getting to something real that's kind of dangerous, but also could be the potential to treat young people seriously and get to a real breakthrough. And so we're still playing with what all that means, but I think it speaks to how difficult it is to ask teachers writ large to do this work. This was a community of teachers that has been working on this for a year in collaboration to build, you know, a new way of doing things that pushes back on a lot of what their school asks them to do. So it's kind of we're just playing with where this might take us.
We have Megan Bang next.
Hi all. Oh, the echo's bad. So the risk of sharing on not fully formulated thought. This conversation has been really interesting to me, and I wondered what and how the panel was thinking about this. And most of this comes from currently teaching high school students, having kids myself, and kind of watching some undergraduate trends that I've been seeing, and I'm wondering about this. So there's something interesting about the what I see is you all pointing to huge increases in a form of civic participation shaping childhood and adolescence right now. Sometimes it seems to me with very narrow courses of action connected to it. So on the one hand, I sometimes feel like the kind of voice that you all are talking about has been away from deliberation and community making, but has become very performative in the voice, in a way that I wonder if is intersecting with kind of adolescent and developmental needs in a way that I'm worried about something like a digital civic fatigue, right? That is about the hyper presence actually, and the capacity of young people way beyond what I think, quite frankly, I feel more and more dated every day, because I think that the kind of language and attention to language that young people are engaged in now is like warped, hyper warped, hyperspeed warped beyond what I think most of us are doing routinely, actually. And I think, so I worry about that, and I kind of see the fatigue happen for some young people who are still trying to like engage with other people in those formations versus have a mic to represent from. And so it makes me think about some of the original kind of should we questions versus a should I question. And I worry that the kind of intersection of a kind of I paradigm is still present in a way that I worry for young people about this. The other thing that I'll say about that is, and this is directly connected to the reference in the climate change piece. So I also think I see, and this is partly the point that I'm not sure I should say, but I'm gonna say anyway. I'm a little bit concerned that young people are being positioned more and more as a political motivator in particular kinds of ways. And I'll give an example. So climate change activism is a beautiful thing, and what young people have done in the past year and a half is absolutely astounding and history making. And we don't, as a nation, have a climate change education framework. And to change climate change, certainly we need lots of policy things, but there are so many more layered dimensions of what needs to be learned for this republic and maybe all republics to respond to climate change in any serious way, that I sometimes worry that people think engaging in climate change means that we only need to get policymakers to change. If we all stopped eating beef right now, we'd take care of 55% of the carbon problem in the world, right? That's not we don't need a policy change for some viable courses of action. We would need a much different education about what actual carbon offsets, carbon problems are. And instead, we're driven by a fossil fuel paradigm that isn't totally accurate, actually. And activists in the United States have actually shaped fossil fuel divestment as the key issue. And certainly you should all not take me as saying, I think we should divest from fossil fuel and we should think forward. But actually understanding the science of climate change is minimal in relation to the courses of action that we're making available to young people. And so I say that because it's partly why I think we have a panel that's thinking about disciplinary intersections. But there's these two pieces about how I see young people's civic action pretty dazzling to me in some ways, worry about their fatigue, and worry about how much we've narrowed the courses of civic action for young people in ways that are actually like close to disinformation sometimes. And I'm just wondering if you all grappled with that, or see that as showing up in any scholarship right now.
Before I move to the next question, I wanted to share a comment from Sarah Friedman, a related comment that says, for Joe and crew, Colette Dayut's work on kids' narratives about conflict and post-war situations could be useful in helping kids find ways to talk honestly, and perhaps to get past kind of this hyper-focused performative nature of civic engagement in online communications.
Oh, before we move on, I just wanted to, because I think I was just thinking, because what Megan said was very thought-provoking. And I think that we don't have an answer to that yet, but I do think that there's something, there is something about the courses of civic action that are being made available to being very narrow to young people that we've been trying to think about. But I think also what you're saying requires, what we did in our project is that we were getting young people to kind of, almost in like a speculative way, be able to think outside the bounds of what levers of change and how our system of government is set up, and literally imagine like civic superheroes and let their imaginings be the basis of then moving backwards into what is possible. But I worry that that still might fall into what you're saying is not quite what needs to be done in terms of how we could teach for what, outside of current policy options, of what actions we need to take as educators to redesign our entire paradigm of how we educate. So, and then I think that gets into the difficulty of the system that we currently have, and who would consider, like, for example, the fossil fuel industry, the nation state, the political ramifications of changing that is a push that I think teachers and teacher educators aren't there yet, but we're trying. I agree with you, is what I'm basically saying.
You can't see me shaking my head, but I'm shaking my head.
We had Tony Layden next.
I jump in if there's other folks I don't want to come up, but I had an additional sort of thought resonating with Megan's point. Does that make sense? So just briefly, just again, thank you for that point. I think it ties very much to, again, the first panel's point, and I think Bill Golson's response, that there are many important respects in which dynamics of politics are shifting, and the dynamics related both to participatory culture and to the technologies of the digital age are probably a part of some of those changes, which is not to say the fundamentals of politics have necessarily changed, but that there are important changes in terms of what's possible and in terms of things like the roles of gatekeepers, as well as opportunities for voice that young people wouldn't have had in earlier eras. That intersects then, as Walter was saying, with things like the ways in which choice may lead people into echo chambers, and psychological dynamics like motivated reasoning and increased partisanship, especially partisanship tied to party. So those kinds of changes radically, I would argue, and I think we try to argue in the paper, are changing aspects of the landscape of the ways in which young people can participate. And part of the challenge for civic ed in relation to the digital age is that in many respects, we're still in a pre-digital mindset in terms of what are the ways in which young people can get involved. The technologies are opening up all kinds of new options, some of which may lead to some of the kinds of problems I think, Megan, you're surfacing. And sort of part of then our challenge has to be to conceptualize and think better about how we can help young people navigate some of those new opportunities. Also recognizing that many of them will be the innovators in relation to.
Tony Layden was next.
Yeah, I just wanted to focus us on the idea of trust, because it came up in an interesting way in the paper that I didn't feel like got thematized as I wanted it to, because there was this tension between the sense that there's a loss of trust in institutions at our current moment, and then there was this discussion about sort of online education, which is a lot about developing skepticism in young people towards sources of information, which is to the good, but then not realizing that that sort of ramping up people's skepticism in sources of information makes it harder for people to trust. And given the real central importance of trust to reasoning together, civic reasoning, democracy, just to sort of ask as a group what we, us to think about not losing sight of the importance of trust, and in particular thinking a couple of things. One, that by trust I don't mean belief, right? So it often gets used as a synonym in these kinds of conversations, right? To trust somebody is to believe them. But trusting, it doesn't, right? I can trust someone before I've decided whether I believe them. I could, and trust, so that's one point. Second point is that I can't trust someone without being vulnerable to them. And so there's this hard issue about safety and trust, because trusting is not safe, right, in some sense. And then the third point to sort of bring into that is that obviously some responsibility for the lack of trust in society comes from a lack of trustworthiness. So there's both, I think, need for education in how and when to trust, and to see how much we rely on being able to trust each other in order to have any facts at all, in order to be able to think about political positions that we disagree with. I mean, it's sort of almost, in some sense, deeply worrying, this thought that I think we all have, which is that if any part of this report looks like it's taking up a political position, it will be dismissed by a lot of people as untrustworthy, right? And that very fact seems to speak to a deep, deep, deep problem with the possibility of any kind of real civic reasoning. And so then one question is, well, what do we do about that? Yes, I just sort of wanted to get us to think about that issue a bit, and maybe the panelists, since trust came up in several places in the paper, I'd be sort of interesting whether you thought about how they connect or not.
I guess to your last point, there's a meta conversation about trust and the public's trust in an organization like the National Academy. If we can't put out something with a particular position, and that not being able to be taken up and heard, right? So I just want to recognize, right, that it's trust upon trust upon trust. In the Letters of the Next President project that Nicole briefly talked about during the presentation, some of the kind of key fundamental findings from that work was when we started looking at what kinds of civic topics kids were writing letters about in 2016, if we looked for majority minority schools as categorized by NCES versus majority white schools, we saw some pretty stark differences in terms of the topics, right? So guns versus violence as were more likely to be written about in majority minority schools versus college affordability or animal rights or feminism. And so it's essentially, I would think about the ways that a lack of trust in political institutions, particularly for youth of color in this country, can fundamentally be thought about in terms of students feeling safety in ways that I think a different kind of safety than what we've been talking about throughout most of the day, right? Like a literal sense of, can I walk home? Can I feel safe in schools? Do adults have their best interests in my well-being? And so if we're going to talk about, what does trust look like? I wonder where the civic conversation actually shapes student perspectives of trust and their own well-being, and if that even broaches into the kinds of ways that it's before we can get to reasoning or discourse, in my opinion, right? Like it gets to a very fundamental, and this is where I can imagine, the Breitbart headline of, the National Academy says, I could imagine the ways that this becomes a politicized stance. But there are fundamentally different kinds of civics that are being enacted and experienced, at least if we're looking at how kids were choosing to write 4 years ago, and I'm sure they'll continue today.
Great. Well, we're coming up on our end time, and we have two people who've been waiting, Hi Bass and Sarah Friedman, and Frank. So I'm wondering if we just spend another 5 minutes keeping going, but maybe make your comments brief, and maybe it's more suggestions for the committee rather than a topic to engage more conversation. So Hi Bass, you're up next.
I just had a comment about something that came up a while back about whether you could take an open position about racism or such issues. It seems to me that you can formulate an underlying principle there, which is that you're not allowed to make claims, at least make claims without evidence, about members of a group which do not emanate directly from the definition of that membership. So that racism is a part of that. I remember, for example, in the 50s, during the communist scare, that having Das Kapital in your home library qualified you as being called a communist, but then they concluded from that that you were in favor of violent overthrow of the government. So all I'm saying is that and race is actually a social construct, but as long as you specify what the definition of membership in that is, you're not allowed to draw conclusions without evidence that don't emanate directly from that definition. I think that's a general principle that you don't have to defend as being left or right. It's just something about the nature of basic reasoning and precise use of the language.
Yes, so I think he covered one of the topics I was going to approach, but I think the conversation around the performative nature of the conversation, I think I kind of look at that as whether or not instruction is rigorous and relative for students. So if it's climate change and they're motivated by that climate change, and it causes them to examine the system with that foundation in mind, just as if it's race or if it's gender or whatever it is, I think that motivates them to really get into it. And somebody mentioned earlier, I think students are less restrictive in their thinking around solutions because they're younger, and as we get older, we learn more of what we can't do, and we kind of settle in that, and sometimes we can begin to think that way, but I think students think a little differently around it. And earlier in one of the papers, it mentioned civics engagement inherently is political in nature. And I think sometimes we have to be careful with being neutral, because neutral doesn't favor people of color in this country. And I think when we're asking teachers to do certain things in classrooms that we struggle ourselves as professors in institutions of higher education trying to do, I just think that's something we have to talk about. And even in being neutral, sometimes in some groups, they will feel like you've taken a position. And so I just think that's something to consider. There's complexity on all sides.
Great, thank you. And then Sarah Friedman, you want to close us out with our last word for today?
Just really briefly, I think that this panel brings up an issue about discourse and dialogue, and a lot of times we think about interactions and arguments that people have and face-to-face interaction, and the letters to the president raises for me the issue of thinking about discourse more broadly, as sometimes it's monologue and sometimes it's private and sometimes it's processing information. And so ideas of thinking about research on narratives and thinking about, I don't know, I had a student who did some work on quotation culture on the internet, where lots of topics of interest came out, and it was not specifically focused on civics, but it could be relevant to a paper looking at digital affordances. So I don't know, I just wanted to throw those things out for further thought. And I think there's a lot in writing research literature that could be useful. And I can think about what's down there. Carol, I'm sure you know stuff too.
So Greg, can I make one quick closing conundrum? I'd like to pull out, I'm a Virgo, I like to do those things. So this last discussion, I think, raises issues that go across the panel papers. And again, coming back to the complex, nuanced nature of this democratic experiment, that I understand the experiment to be such that you have the right to have racist beliefs if you want. You just don't have the right to act on them in ways that become detrimental to others. So that hobby horse, hobby, whatever it was, well, that Hobby Lobby, it's really not that, but the people that didn't want to sell the cake to the gay couple for their marriage. So it's the one like that, you have the right to have whatever kind of belief you want, but once you have set out in the public arena, you don't have the right to impose it in ways that bring detriment to others. And so somehow, and whatever the norms are, the discourse from the last panel or from from this one, is that you have to be to create, it seems to me, spaces where these difficult issues can be talked about, and where the goal isn't necessarily to make sure you change your mind as much as to get you to articulate. That's why I said earlier that argumentation at the end of the game is about warrants. So that whatever set of beliefs that you have about race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever it is, that we need to be talking about environments in which people can at least hear the other side, can be explicit in this environment about why they hold those particular sets of beliefs. Because in prior part of the history, you could be very explicit about your racist beliefs, and it was okay. What makes it more complicated today is, in theory, you're not supposed to be explicit. So people are implicit, which makes it more difficult. And as long as it's implicit, you don't get to interrogate it. So some kind of way, I think we've got to figure out a way to articulate the real complexity of engaging young people in wrestling with these complex issues that we don't even know how to wrestle with ourselves, quite frankly. But understanding at the end of the game, the only way the democracy holds is that you gotta have room for the racists, you gotta have room for the homophobes, you know what I'm saying? Because otherwise you end up in something where you got a governmental structure, people supporting, so you gotta believe what I gotta believe, you gotta do what I want you to do. And that's the challenge, I think. I would think I would be the last person to say that, but in fact, it is. And I would say even around the Brandisha's comment about the kind of racism that's seen in the digital arena, often around race, part of the job is helping, in this case, young people who are the objects of these to understand the sources of them. That's much more malleable than saying that stuff is not going to appear on the internet, because it will. Why? Because these are these long-standing, deep-seated beliefs that are very pervasive in our society and have never gone away, and they're not going to go away, unfortunately.
Well, I think on those insightful comments, we'll end there. And thanks for everyone for sticking with us. We still have 33 people online and in a fairly full room, so I think we're a success so far in our experiment, and commit partly to the passion that everyone has for this topic. We will regroup tomorrow. This room will be open at 9 o'clock for breakfast, and then we'll start the Zoom. The Zoom will be started earlier, but we'll start with the presentations on Zoom at 10 o'clock tomorrow. So, great. Have a good night.